This is really, I think, our first speaker of our speaker series this semester. This is a new faculty member. We're very excited to have him on board. I know a lot of you guys are probably already in his methods class, so you know at least a little bit about him. But I'd love to introduce you to Bosworth. He works on a lot of environmental justice issues. Teaches our methods class will be teaching, and you can talk about them maybe at the end or at the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
On the two courses you're hoping to teach in the spring. There we go. Good note. Little PR for your spring courses. And today he's going to be talking about pipeline politics. So I know a lot of you, or at least a handful of you guys, are very interested specifically in this topic, but I think also the broader environmental justice theme is of great interest to everybody listening. So Kai, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thanks everyone. I am so happy to be here talking to you today about some of the past research that I've been working on and some of the reasons why I think it's of importance and interest to all of you working on environmental issues of various kinds. So like Don said, my name is Kai Bosworth. I'm a human geographer and a political ecologist, broadly interested in issues of resource extraction and natural resource transportation, and attempts by citizen groups, environmental justice groups, Native nations, and other sorts of political organizations to oppose or otherwise impact the construction and development of natural resource extraction in a time of climate crisis. So what I'm going to be talking about today in particular is a set of stories and research that is concerning pipeline opposition groups in the upper Midwest and some of the opportunities and limitations of the kind of strategy that emerge from one aspect of the anti-pipeline struggle in the Dakotas. So, in the last 10 years, I think that the climate justice movement and the climate movement more broadly has undergone a drastic transformation. Back in 2008 and 2009, when I was really involved in a lot of organizing, environmental organizing for climate justice, we were mostly concerned with lobbying policymakers, getting a kind of climate change policy passed Congress, influencing international negotiations on climate, and overall kind of developing an insider strategy to address climate change. Of course, none of that happened, and by 2009, it really felt like we had hit a wall. Like there was no possibility for creating the kind of climate politics that we wanted to. Since that time, a really vibrant and, in my mind, important transformation has happened in the climate justice movement, which has transitioned away from this kind of insider attempt to pass policy or regulation towards creating a mass movement of the people. We saw this initially at events like the People's Climate March, and now frequently these kind of mobilizations that are understood to be part of a people's climate movement of some kind. This transformation is in some ways resonant with and directly, I argue, directly related to the strategy that emerged against the pipelines in the Dakotas, against Keystone XL, later the Dakota Access Pipeline. There, at the same time that the national green groups were facing problems and unable to develop a strategy for climate legislation, this kind of grassroots mobilization emerged of farmers, ranchers, Native nations, environmentalists, and concerned citizens all opposing the development of this massive, several thousand-mile long piece of infrastructure. Their strategy, I argue, should be understood as populist in nature, and I hope today to explain a little bit about, hopefully convince you a little bit about what populism is and how it can be understood to intersect with environmental politics today. So, a little bit of background. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but you know, there's been a couple of really contentious pipelines that have been developed in the central United States region. The Keystone Pipeline, Keystone 1, was first proposed in 2008 and quickly built across the eastern part of the Dakotas down to Steel City in 2009. The Keystone XL system was added onto that later in 2009 as a proposed pipeline and became increasingly contentious over the next 10 years. The northern portion of the Keystone XL pipeline, which you see here in red, remains unbuilt to this day, due largely to the actions of many of the folks that we'll talk about. Whereas the southern portion of the Keystone XL was actually completed in around 2014. As Keystone XL was mired in controversy and was set to bring tar sands oil from Alberta to refineries in Steel City and Patoka, that pipeline also had an interconnect with the Bakken region in North Dakota, kind of at the center of fracking. And when those producers couldn't get their oil to market, they developed a different plan. Eventually, the Dakota Access Pipeline, or DAPL as I'll frequently call it, was proposed. Because it didn't cross an international border, it was fast-tracked through the environmental regulatory process before eventually being delayed due to a very prominent blockade at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this struggle, and I think it's very important to foreground the ways in which the blockade at Standing Rock recentered an indigenous-led struggle for environmental justice, for water, and for sovereignty over land in this region. And through this struggle, we've really come to understand the fight against the pipelines as being principally about the message that water is life, or Mini-Wachoni, as the kind of principal slogan that was spread in the struggle. But alongside, overlapping, and sometimes in direct contradiction with many of the efforts led by the Anishinaabe or the Lakota, Dakota, and Dakota people, you can really understand a whole host of different environmentalist strategies for stopping or delaying pipelines. And I like to think of this as kind of a field of overlapping discourses, tactics, and groups that sometimes work together and sometimes butt heads a little bit. So we can think of, on the one hand, all of your traditional green groups, like the Big Greens, like the NRC or the Sierra Club, who are primarily invested in stopping or delaying the pipelines using lobbying tactics, lawsuits, and other sorts of legal mechanisms. All the way over across several other interest groups to the other end of the spectrum, where you have your kind of autonomous, anarchist, radical, direct action folks who don't really care about politicians but seek to stop the pipeline through direct action tactics. It's my contention that if we want to understand the field of competing and coalescing politics against pipelines, that we also have to take into account a new kind of emerging movement or form of politics that I call climate or pipeline populism. So the broadest level, populism simply means a kind of popular mobilization that takes the people as the principal subject of politics, as opposed to a kind of elite or otherwise corrupt force that is preventing the people from expressing themselves. And so this is a very difficult concept to kind of nail down in the literature and in now our sort of popular culture. And so I want to be really clear about what my understanding of populism is. So there's three main components that I think are important to understanding contemporary populism and pipeline struggles. So first, populism constructs the people as the privileged subject of politics. So rather than workers, the oppressed, environmental justice groups, it's really the people writ large that are seen to be the struggle, the site of struggle. So you'll hear in hearings and whatnot, oftentimes folks start off with, we, the people, demand that democracy be returned to us, that our decision-making power be heard rather than, policymakers or institutionalized bodies. So second, against the people are opposed politicians, corporations, and elites, which are denounced as a corrosive force on grassroots democracy. So oil companies and oil in general looms large here. Oftentimes, what is preventing the people from expressing their voice is the influence of oil and oil money on politics. It's a matter. And third, populism is skeptical of institutionalized policymaking and political representation more generally. So if the people are the site of democratic political expression, forms of representation that remove politicians from a direct connection to the people are oftentimes seen to be somewhat nefarious. And so utilities boards are the example that came to the fore most clearly in pipeline struggles, being oftentimes appointed rather than elected. The decision makers who are rubber stamping these pipeline projects are seen to be wholly undemocratic. So Naomi Klein, who's also written about populism a little bit, and her book This Changes Everything, also argues that the movement, or various kinds of blockade movements, might not be seen as simply environmental movements at all, but rather driven by their desire for a deeper form of democracy. And while I agree with Klein's sentiment, for me this also raises a number of kind of difficult political questions. Most centrally, what I'm concerned with in this research is, if it is a desire for a deeper form of democracy, what is the character of that desire? What desires animate those who participate in pipeline populism, and with what consequences for the political subjects that emerge from this situation? I'm not really going to talk about the literature conversation that this question emerges from very much. But I'll simply say that the kind of conversation that I'm most interested in is bringing together both a set of political theory and political ecology literatures that are examining social movements and populism in general, as well as a different set of literatures that's more associated with critical ethnic studies, critical race theory, and feminist methodologies, to inform how I think about desire and subjectivity. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the research design, what I actually did, who I studied, and then spend a little bit of time towards then talking about the kinds of results or the arguments or stories that I'm telling about this research. So, a map up here since I'm a geographer. My research site really kind of started in the state of South Dakota, and grew to encompass a number of other sites along the proposed routes of these two pipelines, the Houston XL and Dakota Access Pipeline. So you can see here in blue my three main research sites where between 2013 and 2016 I spent around 12 months doing interviews, participant observation, and studying pipeline opposition movements. So first in Winter, South Dakota here, in Rapid City in the west, and then later when DAPL started to become more prominent in Brookings, South Dakota over here. In red, you see some of the main sites or spaces where I studied events or protests, cookouts, and the like. Just to give you an idea of the scale of this, I put around 15,000 miles on my car driving to interviews, to events, to up and down the route of these pipelines. Although they look pretty straightforward, even getting from here to here, you have to drive like that. So oftentimes, and if I'm living here, like I'll be driving all over here. So I interviewed landowners, ranchers, farmers, environmentalists, worked with a number of community organizations, and so staying in contact with all these folks required a lot of moving around. Now, I've included the administrative boundaries of the 7 major Indian reservations in western South Dakota, simply to show the way in which the pipelines were sort of planned to avoid these spaces. Nonetheless, what the pipeline companies didn't take into account is that this entire territory has long been contested and is to this day as unlawfully dispossessed from the Achaemenid and other Native nations. And so, despite the fact that the pipeline never crosses a reservation border, it's faced intense opposition from these pipelines. Both faced intense opposition from the get-go. And so, understanding that aspect of the story is kind of central to where my particular viewpoint comes in. Incidentally, also, I'm from South Dakota. I grew up in Spearfish, a town in the Black Hills right there. And so this project was also not just a kind of reflective ethnography of kinds of environmental movements that I participated in, but also of many of the kind of people that I grew up with. And so my sort of researcher positionality was incredibly important to doing this kind of research, not as an outsider, but really as a kind of participant and person involved in opposing pipelines.
Mike, could you just point out where the Standing Rock
yeah, so
occupation was?
the blockade is right here. This is the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation right there. And you know, I spent a lot of time up at Standing Rock. My research my research questions cannot be answered by the activity that's there, so I was playing mostly a support role. Thankfully, a lot of other researchers, many of them Lakota, are doing work and putting out books and research and whatnot. So I see this, what I'm about to tell you is complementary to that. So some of the kinds of organizations that I work with, some of these I work very closely, you know, in their offices or blogging or doing research for them. Others I kind of followed in the media. So I divided them into 4 kind of camps here: regional progressive community organizing groups, rural community organizers, environmental justice organizations, landowner organizations or landowner kind of collectives, as well as chapters of nationally supported environmental groups. So if we go back to that field of pipeline opposition that I was describing, you can see here that I've chosen only those kinds of groups that I saw as being involved in a kind of populist organizing. So I'm not doing an ethnography of Native opposition, nor am I studying kind of big greens or legal cases against the pipeline. I'm really interested in these kind of citizen mobilizations that primarily involve non-Native folks. And we can talk more about why I made those choices in the Q&A. So some of the kinds of research that I performed in order to answer this question. So I did about 25 semi-structured interviews with key informants or interlocutors who are involved in many of these organizations, so they could tell me, you know, their stories and help me build a richer picture of opposition to pipelines. But a lot of what I did was more on the level of participant observation. So because my kind of methodology was mostly geared towards understanding collective events, you know, this involved me hanging out in a lot of crowds at public participation meetings like this one in Nebraska, where, you know, the state or federal government provides time for people to give their feedback on the limitations of the pipeline, about 3 to 5 minute speeches. Folks get up and pour their hearts out. I also participated in this, so my, you know, comments are on the record in a couple of these cases. And these became really intense sites of opposition to the pipeline. So you can see here folks are wearing their different shirt colors based on if they're pro or against.
the orange people are pro, I'm guessing. And
Yeah,
red
so
are-
these are,
red are-
yeah, so in later meetings, in early meetings, almost all of the people there were against the pipelines. In later meetings, the pipeline companies start, in their alliance with construction unions, started to bust people in from all over, union members to support construction jobs. I went to a lot of protests, marches, cookouts, concerts, other kinds of celebratory collective event, somewhere between 30 and 40 by my count, in order to participate in, engage in the kind of discourses and stories that people were telling themselves and telling each other about their opposition to these pipelines. And then there's also an archival and document component to this project. So I was really interested in how regular folks interface with the regulatory and policy mechanisms for approving large infrastructure projects. So you see here the environmental impact statement for the Keystone XL pipeline, the early draft supplemental EIS, and later the final one. These were distributed in paper copies to public libraries all along the pipeline's route, as if this were in the interest of transparency, and that folks would just go and check out the EIS for some light reading. Yeah.
Is that the whole thing, or are those individual, like, this copies? Are those multiple copies of the same report?
There's two, so the supplemental EIS, so there's 4 volumes to each of them. So so what's inside this is supposedly all of the data that is relevant to the project. What's going to happen if there's a pipeline spill? Are endangered species affected? Are there environmental justice concerns? All of these kinds of stories are wrapped up in the EIS, and then at these public participation meetings, people come out and be like, or in public comments online, they'll say in section 2.3.13, your assessment was wrong, you said this wasn't part of the sandhills, but it actually is part of the sandhills. And the idea behind this is supposedly that citizens will help the project become better and more accepted. In reality, the EIS process that's connected to NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, is largely at this point in time a rubber stamp sort of situation. Very, very rarely are projects turned over based on EISs. Keystone XL is an exception to that. When the Obama administration, the State Department rejected the environmental impact statement, effectively killing the project for about 12 months prior to President Trump's signing it, or reversing that decision as his first act in executive office of the United States. But that's a longer story. Okay, so 4 kind of important findings that this research, the kind of narratives and stories that I want to tell coming out of it. So the first kind of argument that I make is that we should be seeing these kinds of citizen mobilizations as part of a longer history of environmental justice activism and populist organizing, progressive populist organizing in the Great Plains. Going back to the People's Party, or the Populist Party in the 1890s, South Dakota was one of the states where this was most successful, where a platform of public participation and citizen mobilization was so important to farmers and ranchers that the Populist Party actually ingested the Democratic Party for about 10 years. There's a whole host of interesting characters that are involved in this, like Father Robert Hare, a Catholic priest who brought initiative and referendum laws over from Switzerland, made them incredibly important in South Dakota, and was kicked out of and disbarred from the priesthood for being a socialist. And so the idea that these kinds of histories are, in some ways subjugated in the stories we tell about Middle America, places like South Dakota, which are largely taken to be anti-democratic and conservative, is one of the things that I think is more important. So I tied that kind of populist history to some of the EJ organizing that began to occur in the 1980s, especially against uranium mining and coal mining, much akin to the gathering at Standing Rock in 1980 and 1981. Survival gatherings were held in western South Dakota, where some 10 or 11,000 people came together. These are peace and justice activists, anti-nuke activists, kind of environmentalists and folks from native nations to coordinate with each other on how to oppose resource extraction projects in this region and across North America. So much as there have been many kind of exceptional stories told about Standing Rock, there's actually a long kind of iterative history of these actions taking place in the Upper Midwest. So one of the principal problems that I began to find when I started to do this research, though, was that for non-native activists, it was very, very difficult for them to fit their resentment towards oil companies into the kinds of decolonial and projects for indigenous sovereignty that were occurring at the same time. And so in one of the most difficult kinds of stories and analyses that I produced out of this research, I analyzed the way in which farmers and ranchers began to create analogies between the dispossession of their land by eminent domain being the seizure of private property by the state or public infrastructure, to the dispossession of land from native nations historically as part of settler colonialism and up until this day. And so in this chapter, I analyzed the kind of recurrent phrase that I kept hearing non-native folks say, that they're treating us like Indians, that the oil companies and the federal government are approaching rural America much as they did native nations for periods of time. And to me, this is particularly problematic because I want to hold out hope for a climate justice movement that doesn't see coalitional politics only emerging from a kind of shared commonalities and necessarily structuring around something in which we all have some kind of common history or common future, which populism seeks to, or the kinds of populist movements that I was analyzing sought to go foreground. So this is the chapter that most clearly draws on environmental justice literatures and literatures on race and racism in environmental movements. And this was a problem not only in the terms of the narratives that people were expressing, but also the aesthetics that surrounded pipeline opposition. During, it's hard to imagine, but prior to 2016 or so, most of the stories that were told about pipeline opponents were these kind of individualized stories about older white people and their private property. And so, as in this kind of series of diptychs that the New York Times produced, we get stories of people's land and themselves as individual families being what's most harmed by large infrastructure projects. My favorite kind of story is about the public participation meetings which occurred, there were almost 48 of them, I think I've counted, along the route of the pipeline to try and gauge public opposition or public interest in pipeline construction. So in this particular story, I'm talking about how another phrase that emerged, that Keystone XL hearings nearly irrelevant, that folks feel like they're coming to these public participation hearings, having their voices heard, recorded, and then completely ignored. And in many ways, they're right. So the question that I wanted to ask was, why do we keep coming to these public participation meetings if everyone knows that the decision is in many ways predetermined in advance, or if that's how people feel. This is not a unique story. Many development projects, fossil fuel or otherwise, have these public participation components, and oftentimes if you've gone to one of these meetings, you'll discover that folks feel incredibly frustrated by the sort of veneer of democracy that's not simply not heard, it seems like. And so I kind of surprised myself in this chapter because it turns out that when I started to talk to people, it wasn't actually the hearing or the decision-making power that folks cared about when they went to these meetings, but it was the relationships that they started to build with each other outside of those spaces, the conversations on the edges of public participation meetings. Actually, why people kept coming back was because of the experience of collectivity and kind of shared responsibility for a political future that in their everyday lives they didn't really experience. And so I actually think, contrary to what I hypothesized when I began this project, that public participation is actually incredibly important, even though everyone hates it, basically. So it's important for reasons that are different from the way in which it's often thought. So in this chapter, I'm really arguing against both the kind of negative public participation as a waste of time it sort of takes, and against those who think it's a solvent for a kind of democratic future. And so I just wanted to show you kind of some of what the archive looks like of some of these meetings. So I told you I participated in a number of these, but oftentimes I was going back and looking through archival materials, transcripts and the like. In Iowa, it was particularly interesting because they kept all the documents, the speeches that people read out, and you could compare what they initially wrote with what they said at the meeting. And so you can see here how this person has just shortened it to, instead of saying this whole regulatory hearing is illegitimate, they just say this hearing is illegitimate. This person is modifying a Winona Leduc quote about pipeline opposition and concluding with a slogan from they're referencing their kind of environmental organization. This is just kind of interesting stuff. Similarly, in the last kind of substantive story that's coming out of this research, I really try to try to think about science and scientific expertise, not as necessarily corrupt or already in the service of oil companies or something like that, but as a site of intense contestation and thus identity formation for pipeline opponents. So rather than simply dismissing science as being instrumental, removed from people, and thus opaque and unnecessary, I actually examine how people take that giant EAS and begin to educate themselves, first individually and then often collectively, to try and contest the visions of science and expertise that are sort of emergent in institutionalized attempts, institutionalized environmental review. So from those pedagogical projects, folks then begin to take their scientific expertise outside of institutionalized spaces, as in this pipeline mapping project, which enrolled citizens to follow construction and update where on the route of DAPL construction is happening. To the DAPL Pipeline Watchdogs, another kind of group I participated in, which went around and took pictures and sort of monitored pipeline construction in order to attempt to call regulators whenever any kind of rule was being broken. So I argue these kinds of acts are actually intense, require a lot of knowledge. Like, you have to know the law, you have to know what the difference between types of soil is, what construction in rain looks like, that kind of thing. So these become spaces in which folks emerge as political subjects oftentimes for the very first time through their sort of engagement with expertise. Incidentally, the pipeline, Bachman's pipeline watchdogs, almost entirely older women. And I think that I try to at least reflect a little bit on the ways in which this kind of challenging expertise from below is for them a kind of quasi-feminist project for folks who might not expect it. Okay, so I'm running out of time. So quickly, I just want to think about some of the ways in which this kind of research can help us reflect on populist politics and climate justice movement more broadly. So as I was doing this research, populism became kind of a buzzword. There's like a bazillion books written by political scientists decrying populism as disfiguring democracy, as responsible for this kind of post-truth era we live in, largely associating it with the political right, and suggesting that the only way to save democracy is to excise populist politics from our political lexicon. And no one seemed to embody this more forcefully than the campaign and eventual presidency of Donald Trump, who really relied on the language of the people to coalesce a kind of political base. So the language of the enemy of the people, speaking for anti-establishment sort of group, so on and so forth. And I was actually quite dismayed at the lack of engagement with really rich history of populist scholarship and social movements, most of which are not of this nature at all, but speak the language of the people and the common people as a kind of progressive political identity and attempt to really reclaim democracy. Trump doesn't, quite clearly does not actually care about democracy in any kind of substantive sense, whereas most progressive populist movements, this is really one of their main kind of platforms. And I've argued that we see this we can see this very clearly in the climate justice movement, in which the people emerges not as kind of ethno-nationalist subject, but instead the sort of articulating a demand that we can, actually build a kind of response to climate change collectively through a kind of democratic process. Nonetheless, I also think that this research has some warnings or cautionary tales for the emergent people's climate movement, most notably around how the boundaries of the people are understood. Is the people they, American, anyone can get involved, or is it more specific to the kind of local communities or organizations that seem to coalesce around such subjects? So I expect as if the people's climate movement emerges as the name or slogan, which many of us become invested in, there will be a lot more activist and scholarly discussions about who the people are and who is not perhaps included in that political subject. So just quite briefly then, I think that this displays, for me, the real tension that's at the heart of populist political subjects. There's sorts of situations in which their will is attempted to be exercised between a kind of utopian fidelity to transformative political horizons, democracy as a project of reclamation, versus a kind of drag back into the muck of everyday pragmatics. Democracy as a kind of local, small-scale conversation. And this is not to suggest that one is better than the other. It's a tension because they're, in some ways enmeshed in each other. And how that tension is expressed, I think, has a lot to do with what kind of climate justice movement we see emerging and building power in the next few years. Okay, so with that, thank you so much. Happy to answer a question.